Okay, so economic growth. What is it? Why is it important? And then the rule of 70. Let's talk about that quickly. The rule of 70 is a sort of a back of envelope quick calculation that says the time for something to double, the time that it takes for it to double, is equal to 70 divided by the rate at which it's changing. So, as an example, let's say that our economy was growing at 7%. Okay, so the rate of change was 7%. How long would it take for our GDP to double in value? Well, 70 divided by 7% growth gives us 10. In other words, in 10 years, we will have doubled our GDP value if our economy was growing at 7%. But the rule of 70 doesn't just apply to growth. It can be the change in anything. So what about, say, prices? If inflation, right, was 10%, how long would it take for the price of something to double? In other words, price of milk, right? If inflation is 10%, 70 divided by 10 is 7. It would take 7 years for the price of milk to double. What happens if the price of milk, if you are someone that buys things quite a lot, you buy milk, bread, whatever, say you're buying milk, and you notice that the price of milk doubles over 5 years. What does that tell you about inflation? What does that tell you about the price of milk? Well, it'll tell you that inflation, or milk inflation, was 14%. In other words, 5 is equal to 70 divided by 14. Simple. Cool. So, let's go back to growth. What is it? Well, it's an increase in real GDP over time. Well, we could also think about it as being an increase in real GDP per capita over time. GDP per capita, in other words, the average GDP allocated to each person in the economy. That's what we mean by growth. Why is it important? Well, it lessens the burden of scarcity. In other words, if we grow, we have more resources. One of our problems, one of our our fundamental economic problem is this idea of scarcity, right? What does growth do? It allows us to have more. In other words, less scarcity. And in that sense, growth is important for our well-being. Growth enables us to have better healthcare, more food, better housing, better education, things like that. But what does it mean in terms of what we've seen before? Well, remember way back in the dawn of our macroeconomic history, we had our production possibilities frontier, capital goods, this was consumer goods, right? And essentially, if our PPF was pushing outwards, moving away from the origin, we called that growth, right? In other words, over time we can consume and produce more of both capital and consumer goods. Okay? Alternatively, if we're looking at Alternatively, if we're looking at level of output over time, what we're saying is that even if GDP goes up and down and up and down and up and down, the long trend is up, right? If over time the level of output is trending upwards, even if it goes up and down and up and down, if over time it's trending upwards, that's economic growth. Cool? What are the costs of growth, however? Well, remember we said that if this was consumer goods on our x-axis here, well, the more consumer goods we consume in any one period, in other words, the further we are down this curve, right, the closer we are to the x-axis, the more consumer goods we're producing and the less capital goods we're producing, the slower our growth. Whereas the higher we are up on this curve, or closer to the y-axis, if we were at a point, say here, then we would be consuming, or we would be producing, more capital goods and producing less consumer goods. But with more capital goods, we would be growing faster. So therefore, one of the costs of growth is that we forego current consumption. The more we spend now on capital goods, the less we can consume now. So we forego current consumption. Of course, with growth, historically has come pollution and the depletion of our natural resources, as well as environmental issues. We have to then, if we're thinking about things from an economic perspective, we have to say, well, if these are the costs, what are the benefits? And we're then weighing up cost and benefit, because that's how we think in economic terms. And of course, to growth, there's these human issues, in terms of abuse, of labor, cheap labor in Asia producing our Nike shoes. It's good for us, but it's not really good for them. And what we find with our growth is that it does tend to go up and down and up and down, and that leads us to what we call the business cycle, and that will be our next video.